Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Open Forum podcast. Today, we have with us Norman Fenton. Norman is a professor of risk and information management at Queen Mary University in London, as well as the director of Agena Risk. Now, he also has around, give or take, 400 publications in his name, as well as published a few books as well. And Norman, that's a very, very brief little nutshell into who you are. Can you maybe take 2 minutes, tell the audience a little bit more about yourself, and then we're just going to dive on in.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a mathematician by training, and my current focus is on critical decision making, and in particular on what we call quantifying uncertainty using causal probabilistic models that combine data and knowledge. And it's an approach which we call sort of smart data, in contrast to sort of the big data fad. And unlike others in this space, we don't just do number crunching. So we look at causal explanations for the data, biases, uncertainty about its accuracy, and key information that's missing. And a lot of our work has resolved around using these are sort of Bayesian methods to do statistical safety and risk assessment in critical applications like transport, consumer products, stuff like that. I've also done a lot of expert witness work, looking at impacts of different types of evidence, specifically things like forensic match evidence like DNA. But the key thing is that much of the work that we were doing prior to the COVID crisis was actually in medical decision making, and in particular improving diagnostic and prognostic accuracy using a combination of, often you have limited data, you don't have a lot of data for these types of medical decision-making problems, and combining that with a sort of expert judgment. And I was leading a large interdisciplinary project which was focusing on chronic conditions like diabetes, arthritis, and heart failure, working with specialist clinicians. So it was kind of like inevitable that when the COVID crisis arrived, I'd be drawn into looking at COVID data and decision-making.
Absolutely, yeah. You're already kicking around in the neighborhood of healthcare, the COVID situation. So it's only natural, I think, that one, your curiosity would peak a little bit, and two, that when things maybe weren't adding up, you'd take a deeper dive into the statistics yourself, especially given your background. Now, that kind of brings us neatly onto the fact that you have a whole bunch of publications and work that is done prior to any of this COVID stuff. And a lot of that is published, peer reviewed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, in the recent months or recent year or so, you found that the publication aspect is difficult, would be putting it mildly. You had some stuff published with your COVID work, but then all of a sudden that came to a bit of a grinding halt, right?
Yeah, because well, interesting enough, right at the beginning, so we published very early on in sort of reputable journals on COVID, because we were looking at, I guess, stuff which wasn't considered to be challenging the narrative. What we were doing is we were using this sort of Bayesian causal modeling to sort of identify, again, as I said before, explanations for the data we were seeing. So, for example, there was a lot of stuff early on about very big differences in the case fatality rates of sort of countries which should have been similar, in Europe, comparisons, for example, to England and Germany and stuff like that. And people were saying, this must be due, they've got a much lower case fatality rate. So that means that their lockdown or their is working or their hospital system is doing better and stuff like that. But actually, it was much more, there were much more significant explanations, like, for example, how you report whether or not, how you're reporting COVID deaths. So, for example, right at the beginning in the UK, and also, of course, the amount of testing you were doing, critical things, and they weren't being taken into consideration. Now, in the UK, at the start, right from the beginning, we were defining a COVID death as anybody who tested positive with a PCR test, anybody who died within 28 days of testing positive with a PCR test, right? So that already, of course, that ever since we now know the fundamental problems of that, because we don't know whether they're dying because of COVID or with it, and there's all those problems. Now, at the beginning, the only people in those early months, the only people in the UK who were really being tested, getting the PCR test, were people were already hospitalized with the symptoms of COVID.
Yeah.
Okay. And so these are already people who were gravely ill with the virus. I mean, also some frontline, obviously, medical workers were getting tested, but the vast majority were people who were very ill with COVID. And of course, a lot of those, you know, not a lot, but plenty of those were dying. So you had this, what appeared to be this massively inflated infection rate, especially when you're using this 28 days of dying with a PCR test. Whereas, as I say, other countries were using different death reported, that were defining a COVID death differently, were maybe doing more testing. And so what you had was these artificially inflated case fatality rates, i.e., you know, the lethality, let's say, of COVID was being exaggerated right from the start. So we looked at that. We again looked at data on all different countries, and we came to the conclusion very early on that the infection rate, i.e., the number of people who were getting infected, was very much higher than was being reported. But the fatality rate, i.e., how deadly it was much lower than was being reported. So infection was more widespread than people believed, but nowhere near as fatal and as deadly as people were saying. So we were publishing that stuff, and the countrywide comparisons and all that stuff was being wasn't really challenging the narrative. In fact, here's the interesting thing, that we were saying that one of the problems why you're getting these distorted figures is because it's so dependent on testing, on the number of people you're testing. And if you really wanted to get a feel for how widespread the virus was in the population generally, rather than those who are only in hospital with it, you know, you need to do more random testing. We didn't realize at that time how bad and unreliable the PCR testing was. That was something that came later, right? So we were recommending this, and I'm not saying it was a result of our recommendation. I'm sure because other people, you know, were saying it, but that soon after, in the sort of summer, especially late summer of 2020, of course, in the UK, they started to do mass testing of asymptomatic people, all children going back to school, people going back to work after the first lockdown. You had this massive exponential increase in the number of people being tested. And this was where things started to go wrong with going back to your question about the publications, because I and some colleagues, we started to point out, hang on a sec, at that point, the government was only reporting this exponential increase in cases. And of course, the more people you test, right, the more cases you're going to find. And most of those people who either have mild symptoms or don't have any symptoms are never going to get symptoms, right? They're simply false positives. That's something else. I mean, we can talk about the false positive thing, because that's a big thing, because we'd already realized a lot of these were false positives, right? Yep. Through other work we were doing. And so if you massively increase the testing, you're going to massively increase the number of cases. So, you know, a case is defined as a person testing positive on a PCR test, irrespective of whether that's a false positive, irrespective of whether they've got symptoms or ever developed symptoms, right? And so simply by pointing out the fact, actually, you need to at least divide the number of cases by the number of tests you're doing, right? So you at least normalize against testing. So that's when we found out that the act of dividing two numbers was a very, very subversive act, because at that point, pointing this out and showing, actually, when you do that, you don't see there isn't only an exponential increase. There's no increase whatsoever, really, other than sort of mild seasonal things, you know, that you inevitably get with respiratory viruses. And so from that point on, anything that we did, all the work we were doing, which was pointing this stuff up and pointing this stuff out, and was dependent on identifying these kinds of, you know, teasing out these kinds of problems with the data. You know, that was already the start, being called, you know, spreading misinformation, a COVID denier, I was called. And none of these publications they weren't even getting reviewed. It wasn't that they just were getting rejected. They weren't getting reviewed. So we submitted papers on all, you know, number of aspects of this sort of testing, the whole sort of testing issue and the numbers coming out of that. And they were saying, this is not, it was either, it was not accepted, not reviewed on the basis that it wasn't of sufficient interest, or it was out of scope, bizarrely, even though everyone was talking about this. And it got to the stage later on, later on, of course, we weren't doing anything with vaccines. When we started to look at the issue of efficacy and safety of vaccines and highlighting some issues there, let's just say that was when, at that point, we couldn't even get our papers onto the preprint servers. That's unheard of.
You got blackballed, essentially.
So the only place where we could get anything out in public apart from our blogs was on there is a preprint server called ResearchGate, which isn't sort of recognized as highly as the other preprint servers like medRxiv and Archive, but it's almost like it's the worst. It's the sort of the least. People sneer at you. You're really
almost a Wikipedia.
If you've got to go to ResearchGate, it must be rubbish.
Yeah. Like if you were to prepare your presentation at school from a Wikipedia page, kind of thing. It's got all the info. But that's where I've read a fair bit of your work doing research for this as well. We've covered a fair bit of ground in that answer, actually. Just to sort of bring things back a little bit, one of the first things that you mentioned was the infection and fatality rate, and the big issue there with the fact that we're only testing people that were virtually knocking on death's door, already in hospital. And in the beginning, we know there was a massive increase in death rates as well. So essentially what you're getting at there is, if you're only testing the people that are a higher likelihood are going to die, and you're not testing anyone that's kicking about at home that's got the sniffles, you're going to lose a massive part of the picture. And then again, like you mentioned, the infection rates were much higher than we thought, and the fatality rate, once you get a picture of the true infection rate, which I don't think even to this day we have a real idea of what the actual infection rate is.
There's so much uncertainty about that still.
And that's where I wanted to head to next, as you also mentioned that the PCR tests, which the last 2 years have been based off of, essentially also had a big question mark about them, because at least in the stuff that I read initially, it wasn't a test that was fully validated, and it was given approval within a few days of it being produced. Can you maybe talk to us about the false positive rates? And also, another important thing that maybe doesn't get picked up as often is there's also a false negative rate as well. In fact, the false negative rate is actually generally much higher than the false negative rate, although the way it works, it's not as impactful on what you can conclude from a positive test as the false positive rate. So here's what people don't. There's so many things about this that people don't understand, right? We don't know a lot about the actual. So a false positive is simply defined as somebody testing positive on this PCR test when they don't have the virus. Okay. Now that's dependent on so many things for a start, because there's the issue about whether or not they're symptomatic or asymptomatic. Because of course you can be symptomatic and not have the virus. You can have similar symptoms and not have the virus. You can be asymptomatic and still have the virus as well, but you're much more likely not to have it. But the point is that it's dependent on that. Of course, it's dependent on what sort of cycle threshold you're running the tests at, right? We also found issues with a major problem, which created an enormous number of false positives, was where they were simply, and which is not well known, we wrote, but we're the only people who raised this issue properly, was the fact that in the UK, over quite a long period of time, in 2020 and 21, they were actually determining that they were classifying tests as positive on one gene, when the minimum requirements, both from the World Health Organization and from the kit manufacturers, was it had to be at least 2 genes. And we found that there were weeks where approximately 30% of the positives were actually on single genes. So by definition, they should have been ruled out completely. They should never have been classified. So things like that. But here's the biggest misunderstanding of all. The false positive rate, let's say for an asymptomatic person, is actually very low, right? Let's
it's actually well under 1%, right? But that doesn't matter. It's not what matters in determining how many people who test positive are wrongly positive, as opposed to the false positive rate, is what the infection rate is, what the population infection rate is for that population you're testing. So let me give you, I'll actually spell out an example here. Let's just suppose that we know that, let's take the asymptomatics, because so many people who are being tested are asymptomatic, right? Among the asymptomatics, right, we know that, let's say in a given period, we know that, let's say 1 in 1,000 do have the virus. Let's suppose that. That's actually, let's suppose that 1 in 1,000 at any one time who don't have the symptoms do have the infection. And let's suppose that we're randomly testing these asymptomatics. So we test 10,000 of them. So we're testing 10,000 asymptomatic people. Then we know that about 10 of those really do have the virus. Okay, so think about that. And let's suppose, let's suppose the test is accurate. It doesn't have false negatives. So we suppose all of those 10 test positive, right? So you've got 10 who really have the virus out of the 10,000 who are testing positive. So that leaves just under 10,000, 9,990, just under 10,000 who we know don't have the virus. Now let's suppose the false positive rate is 1 in 100, is 1%. So it's low, it's 1%. That still means that actually about 100, just under 100 of those others who don't have the virus will test positive. That means we've now got 10 who have the virus, we know, out of the 10,000, but we've now got 100 who test, and they test positive, but we've got the 100 who don't have the virus who test positive. So actually, that means that only 10 out of the 110 who are testing positive have the virus. So actually, that's basically, you've got there's less than a 10% chance that you've got the virus when you test positive, given that you're asymptomatic. Yeah. Even though, so basically the percentage of false positives around is that, it's just about 90%, even though the false positive rate is only 1%. That's why you've got to balance out. It's not the false positive rate. In fact, we know we actually looked at real data on this. We looked at a study of asymptomatics in Cambridge, and we know that the actual false positive rate the approximate false positive rate for asymptomatics was actually less than 0.5%. But nevertheless, it was less than half. But nevertheless, over 80% of those testing positive were false positives because the infection rate generally was so low. So it still meant that most of those testing, and people don't get that difference, right? And so people, and it's even and one of the problems is as follows. So people say, well, hang on a sec. How is it possible if if such a high proportion of those asymptomatics were tested positive, really false positives? How come, in the summer of 2020, there were so few people who were PCR positive? And there's a completely different reason for that, which nobody seems to realize. And it's so obvious, and it's true, and we know it's true, is that when there were very low numbers of people testing positive, right, because the infection rate was really low then, and in fact, not that many people were being tested anyway. They were actually doing confirmatory testing then. And when you do confirmatory testing, right, assuming you've got independent tests, it's almost impossible then to get a false positive, right? So, because then it becomes incredibly, it's probability that you get false positive tests of the same person twice in a row is it's incredibly unlikely. But of course, they never did when they were ramping up the testing. Doing the mass testing, they never do confirmatory testing. A person, if you test positive on a PCR test, you don't get invited back. Very rarely you're going to get invited back for, positive. That's it. You have to isolate. You're classified as a case. That was it. You are a COVID case officially.
Yeah. I only know of one person in the last 2 years that has had a confirmatory test, and that was because she's a doctor. She managed to get herself back into test again because she was 100% positive that the test was wrong, and she wanted to keep working. So she went and got herself another test, came back negative and was like, right, game on. I'm going to continue on doing what I'm doing.
But the interesting thing is whether, I bet you that first positive, they classified that as a case. Because that's the thing, they don't distinguish, they don't individualize it. It's just counted as a case. So the fact that person's subsequently was found not to be positive still doesn't, they don't delete that number from the case total, you see.
Yeah. Which brings us on to another interesting point of the chicanery with the numbers, right? That you've already mentioned a few times that we had these sudden bursts of case rates. We had these sudden bursts where there was mass testing of absolutely everybody. Before we start talking about how the numbers were played with a little bit, can you maybe talk to us about why you came to the realization of mass testing maybe wasn't a great idea? We've kind of touched on it with the explanation you just gave of the PCR testing, but can you maybe give a bit more of an answer as to why mass testing also wasn't really
one thing,
needed?
That mass testing, I mean, let me say in advance that I've really focused mainly on UK data. I do know quite a bit about other countries, but most of what I'm going to say is relevant, to the UK. I'm sure it does carry over. So when they did that, they started that mass testing, right, just after they eased the first lockdown, right?
Yep.
And of course, what happened was you get this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. So you start to so I thought, well, we're going to have to mass test because just in case now we've opened up, if the case rates start going up again, we're going to have to lock down again. Well, of course, you start the mass testing, and given the problems I've already explained about these sort of, the issue with false positives, and of course, what happens is that apparently then you see, well, okay, we've got the case rates, we've got the massive increase in case rates, right? And so that's now going to drive policy decisions about lockdowns, which it did.
Yep.
You even before the full lockdown, there was this interesting thing. So we had a full lockdown. It came again in December of 2020 in the UK. But it was interesting because even before that, they had these incredible decisions. They had these incredible policy decisions whereby individual areas or councils in the UK were told that they had to introduce their own restrictions, council-wide, district-wide restrictions, if the number of cases, listen to this, the number of cases reported was more than 100 per 10,000 population. Not per 10,000 tests, but per population. So therefore, if you wanted to either avoid lockdowns, if you're in charge of a council, you want to either avoid lockdowns or get lockdowns, you just have to increase or decrease the amount of testing you do. It had nothing to do. It's the most insane thing. I couldn't believe that this was being done. They were literally not taking account of the number being tested. It was simply based on the number of cases they found per population of that district. I mean, this is insanity.
It's almost like they were given a bit of a get out of jail free card of whether or not they wanted to or not to, just by, like you say, turning the dial on the amount of tests that they were doing.
Exactly. And given that the narrative, and this is when, of course, why this became really problematic is because you already had the narrative then, that there's the vaccine is coming, right? And so the kind of like the zero COVID people, and as well as those, let's say, who were invested in this whole sort of vaccine, those with sort of pharmaceutical company funding, etc. Those who have some sort of interest, let's say, in the vaccines. That's when you had this narrative that now, if we got a reason, if we can lock down, if we lock down before, then we can, by the time the vaccines come in, the vaccine's going to save us. But let's lock everything down until the vaccines come. That's the zero COVID. And so a lot of people had a kind of an interest. Their narrative was focused on lockdowns for that reason, because it fitted in the wait for let's absolutely do everything possible to minimize the spread of COVID until we've got the vaccines, right? And so the testing numbers driving that narrative of the lockdown narrative. And what's more, this is what really gets me, is people weren't looking at other indicators which were there, which were showing that these supposed massive second and third surges in the winter of 2020 and early 2021 were not really COVID. There was nothing that much there of COVID at all, because you only had to look at the NHS data, the National Health Service data on COVID triage, ambulance triage calls and actual ambulance visits. And what you saw there was you did have the real peak when the pandemic was really on in March and early April of 2020. It was very high, but thereafter, all you had was the normal winter respiratory virus, just sort of small, it didn't fit in with the peaks that you were seeing in the case numbers being reported, by the other government dashboard of just the case numbers.
And was that from the ONS case numbers then?
Yeah. That was the ONS case numbers. Yeah.
So this is where we come into the chicanery with the numbers, as you mentioned. There's other ways that you can almost verify the data. There's a number of different systems or ways in the UK to do that. But if I'm not mistaken, you guys have also looked at previous waves of influenza, right, in previous years. And
yeah, although it was this is something that we looked at very carefully early on, and then basically what happens, it suddenly became we no longer had access. We couldn't get access to the detailed influenza data. It used to be there, and then I think that because people like us maybe were looking at this, it suddenly became very difficult to get that data. But certainly we looked at there are also things like the other thing you have to look at was the formal reporting of infectious diseases, right? And that you see that there's almost nothing on COVID there, whereas of course there was, compared with previous years of influenza, even it was even lower than that. So that was a curious thing, and people have said to us, but the reason for that is that doctors know not to bother with that, even though actually it's illegal. My understanding, it's actually a legal requirement to report every incidence of every case of COVID should have been reported there, but almost none were being reported. So you've got these completely different databases, like the infectious diseases databases, where COVID is almost non-existent. Right, it really is. It's really almost non-existent. But as I say, they've got their excuse already lined up for that. But doctors knew they didn't really have to report it there. Well, that's not clear. Again, that's something that other people are sort of challenging. That's a separate issue. But it's been very, very difficult to make those comparisons with influenza. But as I say, I think the best indicator that of the extent to which it was being exaggerated is simply looking at the NHS triages on COVID, how that changed from the early when there really was a pandemic to compare to what was seen later. And then of course there's the other issue about then you had things like the Delta. There definitely was an increase in summer, let's say, of 2021 with the sort of the Delta variant. I mean, that's curious. That's when I got COVID then in the summer of 2021. So I know it's real, and I know it's a sort of a nasty thing to have. And again, is that what you'd expect from a normal? When you've got a virus like this in circulation, it's going to be seasonal. It was curious. That's something that, that's, of course, there are people who have their own explanations about that. And people have suggested, of course, that was when, of course, the mass vaccination program started. And since we now know that it really is a leaky vaccination, there's, of course, a hypothesis that really unusual, that was an unusual, let's say, surge. That was an unusual surge. What was the explanation for that? Okay, so that is that's, let's say, open to debate.
I think that's the interesting bit around Delta is the fact that, as you say, we have seasonal moments for respiratory viruses, and that was
Yeah.
during the summer, which is one of those times where you
Yeah.
don't expect
Exactly.
one
Yeah.
to be about. So that's where it gets curious with that, and I think that's sort of another topic in its entirety of why exactly did we get that. I've spoken with an immunologist about the leaky vaccine situation as well, and it's again another interesting thing to see and to look into. But one of the other things with the vaccination program, and I think this is something that you've mentioned on previous occasions, is one way to look at the overall efficacy of what we're doing is excess mortality rates. And there seems to be a correlation, and correlation doesn't always equal causation, of course, to an increase in excess mortality right around the time of these drives for the vaccine push for an extra dose. And we're now looking at, I think Boris mentioned recently, a fourth dose might be needed. Can you maybe talk to us, one, about excess mortality?
Yeah.
Two, there was also a Freedom of Information Act request made that looked at the amount of people that died of COVID with no other underlying conditions that came out to about 17,000, and why that being touted in and of itself as only 17,000 people died of COVID is also a little bit of misinformation, because that's not the only measure that we can use, whether or not COVID was the only thing. So why don't we start there before we go on to the excess mortality
Interesting.
aspect?
I'm that 17,000 figure. I prefer to look at what a much more unambiguous figure, which was the data on COVID hospitalization deaths in the first year, right? So there were, in the UK, there were 95,000 COVID positive hospitalization deaths. So that's classified as COVID, right? People died in hospital. And we know that only 4,400 of those were people who didn't have at least one serious comorbidity, right? And of course, even those were not necessarily, even though amongst not necessarily all of those 4,400 died because of COVID either, because again, it still meant that they could have been an accident victim. They would still have been classified as COVID. So we know that the proportion who truly die only because of COVID, right, out of those who have been classified as COVID deaths is very small. Right? So that 17,000 out of, I can't remember over the time period, sort of is also, is converged with that, but I prefer to look at that because I know I haven't got access to it now, but I know the paper that looked in depth at those, and there's no question in those statistics because these were from they were from the NHS records for each individual patient. Okay, so so there's that issue in terms of excess deaths. The problem is, of course, the massive problem is there are so many potential explanations for the excess deaths, right?
Could be car crashes.
It could be, well, no, but it's how much of it, you've got the sort of the impact of the lockdowns, the missed cancer diagnosis, missed heart heart problem
screenings
screenings and all of that stuff, right? The potential increase in suicides, but it's mainly the lack of access to health, lack of access to testing for sort of cancer and heart patients, especially that could well explain a lot of those numbers. So you could say, it's not due. Those aren't due to COVID, but it's due to the impact of the restrictions imposed because of the lockdowns. You've got, the thing is, we've got the evidence of the excess COVID deaths in that early period, but since then, again, there's certainly no convincing evidence that the periods of excess deaths have been due to COVID. As you said, there have been peaks in excess death at times with the vaccine rollout. I mean, this is the thing that we looked at in most detail recently, this issue of what is happening with all, because we look at the all-cause, rather than, see, it says better than excess deaths. We look at all-cause mortality, and then you can compare for non-COVID deaths. We then do look at the historical life table values, which is, again, is sort of is based on the same idea as the excess deaths. We're looking at the historical, how it mounts up against the historical figures. But our assumption is that the non-COVID deaths ought to be, all things being equal, the mortality there ought to be similar to what you see from the life table values, with the normal sort of adjustments, seasonal adjustments if necessary. And of course, that's where we've looked at this in detail. We've done that. And see, what we found was that that's where we found that the ONS statistics were simply flawed. We were getting the statistics on the sort of the vaccine surveillance statistics, on which all of the statistics about the efficacy and safety of the vaccine were based were basically flawed. And therefore, any conclusions that the government was making and still makes about the efficacy of the vaccine and the safety of the vaccine, because it's based on statistics which we know are fundamentally flawed and or biased, that's a problem. And why do we know they're flawed? Well, this was the study that we did. Of course, people say, oh, it's not peer reviewed. But actually, 500,000 people now, actually, even though it's only on ResearchGate, have actually seen this work. So it's actually very widely publicized, and nobody can. And all of the zero COVID people, all of our normal critics who say it's
we'll call it
misinformation. They haven't been able to challenge every challenge they've made. We've been able to say why that's invalid, and I can explain what some of the challenges were. But
yes, please.
Here's the story. Here's what we saw. Here's what we found. We looked at the weekly data. First of all, we're looking at all-cause deaths, most importantly of all. And why is that important? Because over a period for vaccinated against unvaccinated. Why is that important? Because if the vaccines are as effective and safe as claimed, then over a period of time, you'd expect to see the COVID deaths amongst the unvaccinated at a higher rate than the vaccinated. But on the other hand, if the vaccines are as safe as claimed, we shouldn't be seeing any significantly more deaths in the vaccinated, the unvaccinated, due to adverse reactions. So when you add the COVID deaths and the non-COVID deaths together, what you should be seeing, if the vaccines are as safe and effective as claimed, is a lower mortality rate in the vaccinated compared to the unvaccinated. Now, first of all, when the first data came out about vaccinated and unvaccinated and the all-cause mortality, people were saying, well, hang on a sec, actually, there's a much higher mortality rate, all-cause mortality rate in the vaccinated. But actually, that was because that people were looking at, that was lumping all the age groups together. And you can't do that, because that is unfair to the vaccine, in the sense that because most people who die are in the older age categories, and because the older age categories have by far the higher proportions of vaccinated, it's inevitable it's going to be confounded by age. So we always said, forget that. You've got to look at Indo-Pacific age categories. And that was we had to struggle hard to get the data. We had to get, the ONS weren't publishing that data. And so they were giving they were using models. We wanted the raw data, and it took a lot of time to get the raw data. Eventually we got the raw data for the age. It wasn't very well categorized, but it was good enough for the older age categories. So we had the 80 plus, 70 to 79 age category, 60 to 69. So, and then it was less between 60 and 10, which that big young category, again, was going to be massively age confounded. So you couldn't really do much with that, right? But it's these older age categories that we looked at, because that was good enough. We weren't now age confounded. We could look at these, and each week, on a week-by-week basis, over the whole of the 2021 data we had since when the vaccination program started, we now had the data by vaccination status and whether they whether they died and whether it was classified as a COVID death or a non-COVID death. So we had superficially all the data we needed, and we found the following. When you plot it, in each age category, you get a similar weird phenomenon, right? What you see is the following. When you look at non-COVID mortality, we were seeing these big peaks in non-COVID mortality in the unvaccinated, coinciding with the time when the vaccination program peaked for that age group. And that peak occurred at different times for the different age groups. So you start with the 80 plus age group. They were getting vaccinated first, earliest. So their peak, when they reached sort of almost 80, 90% of everyone getting at least one dose, that was actually fairly early in 2021. And the peak, this weird peak in non-COVID mortality amongst those who didn't get the vaccine, was happening at exactly the same time when the vaccination program had peaked. Now, why on earth, what is the possible explanation for the unvaccinated dying a non-COVID death at the same time when the vaccinated had just all been vaccinated? Doesn't make any sense at all. And of course, there's only one you can, and the same when you looked at the other age groups, you were getting a similar peak, but at a different time because they were peaking the vaccination at different times. So, you know, the 60 to 69 age group, their peak in the vaccination rollout occurred a couple of months later. And woe betide, that couple of months later was when the non-COVID mortality for that age group went up, right? And then it came down. Now, it turns out you can actually simulate. We know how you can get, we know how you can always get that sort of pattern. You will always get that sort of pattern on two reasons. It gives you the same thing. Either you're reporting the deaths, there's a 1 or 2 week lag in the reporting of the deaths. Well, that wasn't the case here, but the other one, which it was almost certainly, is you're miscategorizing. You're classifying people people who die shortly after vaccination are being classified as unvaccinated. And when you do that, and we have ample evidence that that's happening, we've got even more evidence about that even since we first published this. When you get that, then you get this phenomenon. And that's what was explained there. And as soon as you take account of that miscategorization, right, then what you actually realize is happening is there's actually a slight peak in the all-cause mortality of the vaccinated, right, during the vaccination. And that, of course, is probably due to the fact that those people who are being vaccinated first were those who were considered the most critical need. So you're getting people with, you know, who are already sort of immunosuppressed, and maybe the vaccination in some of those cases for the particularly bad ones was simply speeding up what would have been a death within a few weeks anyway. Hence, you were getting that. But of course, you're not allowed to say that because that's suggesting that the vaccine is killing people. No, I mean, it was kind of like, you know, that's now what's interesting is, well, how do people, again, there's more to it than that, but I don't want to go, I can't really go into all of the details, but here is the interesting thing. You know what the main challenge to this, our observations were on this? They said, it's the healthy vaccinee effect. They were saying the following. They were saying that the reason you got that peak, right, is because when the vaccine was first rolled out, when the vaccine was being rolled out to, let's say, each of those age groups, the ones who were close to death were not being vaccinated. And so they were dying at the time when the vaccine rolled out. No, we know that that's not true for two reasons. A, it doesn't match up. Because we actually also got the data from the ONS. We got data about those who are supposedly the most seriously ill people. And so so when we factor that in, you see, no, it doesn't explain those peaks, right? Because you would see that it just wouldn't happen like that in the peaks. Because otherwise you're somehow predicting just at that time, that's when the most of these really seriously ill people are somehow dying. It doesn't later. They're not taking account of the fact there are seriously ill people become seriously ill much, you know,
they become seriously ill every day, not just on one particular week.
Exactly. So, but the other thing is it's not true anyway, because the guidelines, the NHS guidelines, officially state that the people who were most critically ill were the ones who actually had to be vaccinated first, and they were. And we know that even, you know, people in care homes who were close to death, were being vaccinated. There was no, they didn't say to them, we're not going to vaccinate you because you're close to it. It just did not happen. Because actually, if you think about it, you don't want to die. If you're close to vaccination, you don't want to die a horrible COVID death, you know. So if the idea was the vaccines can at least stop you from getting the COVID infection, which is going to make things really horrible, right? So, but yeah, so it's just not the case. And let's just really play devil's advocate here. Let's suppose, okay, we'll accept their arguments. We'll say there's a healthy vaccinee, and it really is the case, therefore, that there was this bias that the people who didn't get vaccinated happened to be particularly unhealthy, and that's why you've got their, you know, that increase in their mortality rate, right? But if that's true, but even if it is true, then fine. That means there's a bias in the ONS mortality data which you haven't adjusted for, and whether it's because of, so what, for whatever reason, once you take that into account, still all of the figures on efficacy and safety are all null and void because they hadn't adjusted for that bias. So, which either way you look at it, all of these conclusions based on it were basically wrong and continue to be wrong because they're still not fixing the problem. They say, you know, the ONS, we've been in regular correspondence with them. So no, we're absolutely sure that these people who, even if they died 24 hours after vaccination, we're still managing to get it recorded as vaccinated. Well, no, we suddenly found evidence by looking at the other ONS mortality, because their surveillance data is based only on England and Wales, and then you've got other mortality data, the whole of the UK, and we found, for example, there were 22,000 people who died within 2 weeks of vaccination who were not in the ONS database. So there's all kinds of problems with that. I mean, and of course the whole efficacy. So the safety figures are all, you know, you can't anything that. So this nonsense about where they're saying things like, you know, 80% of people who are hospitalized or die with COVID are actually unvaccinated. There's all kinds of problems with that, not just because of this kind of data, the misclassification, but also because when you see figures like that, when they say unvaccinated, they mean not fully vaccinated. I haven't had the booster and ridiculous things like this, you know, all that sort of nonsense that's being, you know,
being a bit pedantic about what qualifies and what doesn't qualify. And this is another aspect which obviously you guys, when you corrected the data, then saw, oh, okay, when we do include them in the vaccination group, then it sort of explains a little bit of this rise in all-cause mortality. And
overall, I should point out what we conclude overall. We're not saying that that the vaccinations increase all-cause mortality. What we're saying, because there isn't enough evidence of that, but what we can certainly say is there's no evidence at all that the vaccines have decreased all-cause mortality, and hence there is essentially no justifiable risk-benefit for the vaccines, because that's the whole point. If they're safe and effective, they have to reduce all-cause mortality, and there's no evidence that they do.
Someone might argue that, just to play devil's advocate on that bit, someone might argue that they must have done something for both all-cause mortality and infection rates, because like you said, decisions that were made for the second lockdown in the UK and for other lockdowns were due to the rise in mortality and also the rise in infection rates. And then once we had the introduction of the vaccination schedule vaccination for COVID-19, these things slowly dropped, and then we don't have as many lockdowns. Now, that being said, there are increases in infection rates, but the mortality rate isn't as high.
But we've got, there's an issue about what happened last summer, the Delta. That's separate. But if you forget about that, because that was after the mass vaccination program, and that was reasonably, that was a reasonably sort of deadly instance.
Yeah.
Now, fine, you can say that, but then how do you explain the fact that the case rates of, you've got far more, the vaccines certainly haven't stopped the case rates, right? And they certainly haven't. And when you look at our data, there's no evidence that the vaccinated are dying at a lower rate than the unvaccinated from COVID. So that's the simple answer to that. What it means is that the COVID, the Omicron variant is generally far less deadly. Mm-hmm. People who are vaccinated are not being protected from it in any way whatsoever. It doesn't matter whether if anything, we now see that actually, you're probably better off not being vaccinated if you want to avoid Omicron, even if I won't say any more than that, but there was no, and of course there is also an issue. Everything I said, of course, the reason why we wanted to do the age categorization was not just because you avoid the age confounder, but because by doing that, you might be able to see that there might be a benefit over risk for certain ages in having the vaccine, whereas in others there isn't. And that's the whole point, informed decision making, right? Mm. So it might be the case, I'm to tell you the truth, I'm not convinced of any age category, but at times it looked like, at the beginning, before we knew further stuff, it looked like maybe for the 80 plus, there was a benefit over risk, mm-hmm. right? Not the others, but for things like doing it to children, like to healthy children, is beyond comprehension. I mean, did you know about this study that looked at actually, I want to bring this up because I want to get the details of this right. Let me just check if I've got it here.
While you're doing that, I'll I don't know if you're familiar with this. Maybe I can share it with you later, and I can add it to the podcast bits too. Yeah, there is the largest or one of the largest children's hospitals in Canada has a specific protocol that's been made for children with adverse reactions to the COVID-19 vaccine. They've had to roll out a full-on protocol as a result of the vaccination program, and yet it's still being pushed in children, which I find quite concerning. But have you pulled out?
Yeah, I've got it. Yeah. So this was the paper by this was Ward et al. Right. So this is a UK study. This looked at basically it looked at all hospitalizations of children from COVID in the whole of 2020, when it was at its worst, right? The whole of that year. There were 5,830 hospitalizations of children under 18. So anyone under 18 classifies as a child. 5,830 in the whole of 2020. That, incidentally, is fewer than the previous year admitted with influenza. So that's the first thing to note, fewer than with influenza. Of the 5,830, 251, only 251 were admitted to intensive care at any time. And again, these are children, these are people under 18 with a positive PCR test. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean positive. Now, 28 of those died. 28. However, they reviewed all the case notes. They reviewed the case notes of all of the people in intensive care, actually. But they certainly reviewed all the case notes in detail of those who died. So they've got access to the case notes. Yeah. This is not conjecture, and this is with access to the case notes. Clinicians doing this. They found that only 8 of the 28 were confirmed as likely caused by COVID, right? Of the eight, all had a comorbidity recorded, all of them. 7 of the 8 had a life-limiting condition.
Jeez.
But to all intents and purposes, you could argue, well, not just, it's definite that in the UK, not a single healthy child, not a single one under the age of 18 died of COVID in the whole of 2020. Not one healthy child. And yet, they're wanting to push, the vaccine with all of the known adverse reactions, right, onto healthy children. It's incomprehensible.
Baffles the mind. It baffles the mind. I mean, you've got kids now that are having to deal with myocarditis that we have zero idea what the long-term consequences are going to be, because they're now calling it mild
Yeah,
myocarditis.
exactly. Yeah.
It's inflammation of your heart, and you're a
Yeah.
child. You haven't even, hopefully, not had the chance to have your first beer yet, and you've
Yeah.
already got heart inflammation. Jesus. But um it's baffling. It's it's baffling to say the least, because there's also now news of Pfizer looking at gaining an emergency use authorization for, I believe it's 6 months old and up.
Yes. Yeah.
It just seems to go further and further and further. But with
Of course,
that
there's
said,
legal reasons, aren't there, in the US, that if they can get it to be, if they can get it emergency use authorization for children, then that gives them, then it becomes part of the standard
vaccine schedule.
Yeah, exactly. That's the reason. Yeah.
Anything part of the standard vaccine schedule, and I can add this into the show notes as well.
Yeah.
The companies themselves are no longer held liable for any adverse events, and the US has a whole separate thing that deals with any of that. So it basically mitigates any liability for any drug company that's on the child vaccination schedule, which is why there's like hundreds of But that's again a whole other kettle of fish. Bringing it back down to the ballpark where we're playing today with the stats. Now, as you see it in terms of what you've seen with the infection rates and what you've seen with your work in the past, do you think that, economically speaking, or if we put the economic aspect into it, there was any justification for the lockdowns that we've seen due to the wider effects that they've had?
Oh, look, my view on this is, I consider myself a sort of a civil libertarian. Even if COVID was as widespread and as deadly as it was, there was never justification on civil liberties grounds for lockdowns. That's my personal view. Incidentally, that's why I absolutely declare a bias in all of this stuff, because one of the reasons why, I was really concerned about, it wasn't just that there was no evidence presented for lockdowns, it was because of this obvious infringement of our civil liberties, right, that I objected to it. But obviously that the negative impacts have been massive, and will, it's going to be difficult to recover from this for many, many years. The farming where, as someone said today, it's April the 1st today, which is April Fool's Day in the UK, where people are now realizing they're being hit with a bill for all of the free stuff given out, for the lockdowns. People were happy with lockdowns because a lot of people, not everybody, a lot of people were simply being paid to do nothing.
Sit at home. Yeah, you're on furlough.
What's even worse, but here's the thing, the other thing that always got me about lockdowns, what's absolutely appalling, is that the very people who are pushing it the most, right, and pushing hardest for the hardest infringements of civil liberties, were those who claim to be who previously sort of been the most sort of progressive. You got not just the political class, let's say, who
Boris and
progressive political class, but academics. The role of academics in this is appalling. Is absolutely. I feel ashamed of my profession. I am an academic, and I'm ashamed that academics were at the forefront of pushing, this abuse of our civil liberties. They were the ones who wanted to push down lock down the hardest, impose the most tyrannical restrictions. And the whole point was they were ones who never lost a day's pay over it. They were sitting at home. Most academics pushing for this. They had comfortable, sitting in comfortable houses with gardens. Able to do all their work from a laptop. They didn't, it didn't affect them. They didn't realize, the people delivering their food, had to take the risks they weren't prepared to take. There's that irony, and the ones who were least affected by the outcomes were the ones who were pushing it the most. It's a disgrace. I just don't understand it. Nothing. Well, I had my ideas on why, because right from early on, I realized that a lot of those academics pushing for this, and a lot of the politicians as well, they were quite open about saying, it's the thing. We see this as the opportunity for the Great Reset. They wanted this because it was a way of actually, they wanted that sort of control and restrictions because it fitted into the Great Reset narrative.
Don't let
Which,
a
of
good
course, is
crisis
considered to be
go
a
to waste.
conspiracy. Yeah.
No, and it's still being pushed in a way or manipulated in a way for resetting for climate change and resetting
absolutely.
for currencies and all of this stuff. So
that's why it's not going to go away, is it?
No, absolutely. I mean, you had Rishi Sunak a month ago talking about as a result having to bring in the the digital currency rather, and there's also talk, I want to say, in India and Canada about utilising lockdowns for climate change now. And
But they're doing it here. I mean, because they've already said, you've got to think for the climate, and because they're saying, because of the oil prices and petrol prices are going up. They're talking about you don't drive on a Sunday, and it's good for the environment. It's all that zero carbon. There's the zero carbon agenda and all of that. It fits into it. I mean, look, I was on. Plenty of my academic colleagues were openly delighted about the lockdowns because they said it was helping the environment and they wanted it to continue because of that. They were open about it. There's no conspiracy here. This is what a lot of academics were saying. I can, give you.
Yeah, you can give me names. No, don't do that.
I don't
Let's not put anyone on blast.
People are on the record. There are plenty of academics. I've got stuff on my blog with actual quotes and all this for this sort of stuff. They were open about it, being good for the environment.
And it's
people. They didn't care about businesses. People who had small businesses. This is the other thing. Again, the people who are supposed to care about the working class. The people who and the small business owners, they're the people who were destroyed, most affected by this. And again, it's these so-called, progressive politicians and academics who didn't give a damn about those.
Didn't give a shit. No, not at all.
Didn't give a damn about those people.
And it's funny because the only people that were allowed to, the majority of people that were allowed to say something in contrast to the narrative were those that were pushing for these harder lockdowns and more draconian measures.
Exactly.
And if you said otherwise, you were deplatformed or called a kook or a conspiracy theorist, a hat which
exactly. Independent Sage were the ones criticizing the government most because they weren't locking down hard and fast enough. It's bizarre.
Even Keir Starmer, who's supposed to be standing opposite Boris Johnson and should be a political party that is calling the government into question, taking them to task over their decisions, wasn't saying, hey, what are you doing for civil liberties? What are you doing to small businesses? He was saying, no. You got to go hard in the paint here. You're sitting in second gear. We can crank this up a little bit harder and a little bit longer.
Absolutely.
You were seeing it from an academic perspective as well, of people who, like you say, had the opportunity to sit in a garden and enjoy themselves, where there were many people who were stuck in a flat with no access to green space. And this comes into a whole other aspect of what you mentioned and the effects of excess mortality or cause mortality, of suicide rates or of hospitalizations due to abuse. When kids weren't allowed to go back into school as a result of the mass testing, that also had a massive impact, which on child,
so the impact on child, education and their psychology is unbelievable. That's devastating. It's going to be the ramifications of that. Yeah, exactly. It's generational.
If you're 8 years old, you spent a quarter of your life, which is probably going to be a fair bit of the long-term memories, 6 to 8. You're not going to remember what you were like when you were 4 years old, but those memories will only be a lockdown and mask wearing and all the rest of it and being stuck in four walls. It's
not just that. They've now been indoctrinated into this fear narrative as well. They're never, are they going to ever recover from that?
Yeah, and it leans into a little bit of the whole Event 201, where there was the control over what's seen, what's heard, and what information is allowed to be disseminated. And again, it looks like it was planned to the nth degree in terms of how we're going to go about it and who's going to help push this wheel down the road.
Yeah, I mean, it was exactly, and they followed the 2000, they followed that 201 agenda, to the letter, haven't they?
Yeah.
Even with the extent of the media, the restrictions on what the media could say, and how they would also promote the fear propaganda. All of that was in there.
We've spoken a fair bit, and we've also spoken about the numbers that have been thrown about and how it looks like the media academics were also helping to perpetuate the narrative of things are really quite dire, where when you dig into the numbers, it wasn't as doom and gloom. On that note, where do you think that we're headed to next? Do you think that this is something that is going to be able to be put to bed and put behind us, or where do you see this going?
I don't think it's going to be. I have grave concerns. I mean, the why, for example, is, despite all the evidence of the ineffectiveness of the vaccines and the potential safety problems with the vaccines, even forgetting the safety, we know they don't work. The vaccines don't work, right? Given that they don't work, why are they still pushing it as hard? Why are they still determined to get everybody vaccinated, children vaccinated? It's all fits into that digital, you mentioned it, the digital move towards the digital ID. The only way I think they can pull off the international digital ID scheme is if vaccinations get included on it. People won't be able to travel and visit all the countries unless the vaccination is part of that ID. And therefore, the move towards getting that ID accepted, and of course, that then becomes your currency and everything, your social credit scoring system and all of that, the vaccines are the key.
Yeah.
Without the vaccines, they're not going to get sufficient people effectively buying in to the idea of the digital ID. But if being able to travel anywhere depends on it, people will just accept it, and therefore it will become part of it. And that's where I fear it's going. And I think it's always been about that.
Yeah. There's, to an extent, a bit of social conditioning that's gone into this, to the acceptance. But Norman, thank you very much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you. I hope we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, nice to speak to you. Okay.
You too. Cheers.
Okay, bye.